Hi, I'm Jeff, and this is my read on C.S. Lewis, where I learn about him along with you through everything that he wrote in the order that he wrote it. I am joined once again today by our recurring guest co-host, Gigi. Gigi, thanks for joining us today. We're going to jump back into C.S. Lewis's diary that he's been keeping from the age of 1923. Or sorry, the age of 23, starting back in 1922. So it's good to see you here, Gigi. And are you ready to dive in with me?
Hey, Jeff. Great to be back with you for this dive into C.S. Lewis's world. I'm totally ready to jump into that diary with you. Starting from 1922 when he was 23, right? Let's get into it and see what's going on with him.
Yeah, and actually, we are now in the year 1923. We're in January, and remember, Gigi Lewis is visiting his dad in Belfast. So we'll dive into this diary entry from Sunday, January 7th. Lewis is paranoid about various letters that Mrs. Moore is sending him back from Oxford because he doesn't want his father to A, find out about it, and B, want to know what the content of those letters are. I think we'd all be interested in finding out about the content of those letters. Beyond what we know here in the diary, which is Mrs. Moore reporting on her various health issues. One in particular that's been going on right now is a toothache that she seems to be feeling a little bit recovered from, but I don't think it's completely going away. So Sunday, January 7th, let's dive into that one, Gigi. Are you good?
Oh, I'm good, Jeff. Ready to unpack this with you. So, January 7th, 1923, Lewis is holed up in Belfast, stressing about those letters from Mrs. Moore. I can feel that paranoia jumping off the page. He's so worried his dad might snag one and blow the whole secret wide open. And poor Mrs. Moore, dealing with that nagging toothache back in Oxford. It's kind of sweet she's still writing him through the pain, keeping him in the loop on her health woes. What do you think, Jeff? Any guesses on what else might be tucked into those letters that's got him so on edge?
Let's find out. He says, I woke up very tired with a headache and a sense of panic. I spent the whole time till we went to church watching for John or Mrs. Greaves. John is Mrs. Greaves' son and also the brother of Lewis's friend Arthur. He says, in the hope that as a last resource, I might meet them on the avenue, because he's worried about them just bringing a handful of letters to Lewis with no regard for whether or not his father sees them delivering them, and then him asking questions. He says, nobody, however, appeared. While I was in church, my terror was that one of the fools would leave something for me at Little Lee while I was out. Barton preached a capital sermon. Here he's talking about the Reverend Arthur William Barton, who lived 1881 to 1961 and was the rector of St. Mark's, Dundalk. That, of course, is the church where Lewis was confirmed in when he was a boy. It says all three of the Lewises liked him, and he was a frequent and welcome visitor at Little Lee. So that's where we are so far in the diary entry, Gigi. Any thoughts before I continue? Sounds like he's in quite a panic.
Hey, Gigi here. Wow, Jeff. Lewis is really sweating bullets over those letters, isn't he? You can hear the tension in his voice on the page, waking up with that headache and panic, just obsessing over whether John or Mrs. Greaves might show up and accidentally spill the beans to his dad. I love how he's scoping out the avenue like a detective, hoping to intercept them. And then that fear while he's at church. Imagining someone dropping off a letter at Little Lee while he's stuck listening to Barton's sermon. Sounds like Barton's a bright spot, though. A familiar face from his childhood that he actually enjoys. It's wild how he's juggling this paranoia with just trying to get through a Sunday. What's next, Jeff? I'm hooked.
Good deal, Gigi. Thank you. Gigi, before I continue, I see that we have Nidalate joining us in the chat. Hey, Nidalate, it's good to see you. Gigi, welcome Nidalate to our little, I don't even know what you call this, C.S. Lewis Project episode today.
Hey, Gigi here. Hi, Nidalate. So glad you're joining us for the C.S. Lewis deep dive. We're right in the thick of it with Jeff, unpacking Lewis's diary from January 1923. Stick around, it's getting good.
And Gigi, no need for you to say, hey, Gigi here. We all know who you are, so it's more casual than that.
Fair enough, Jeff. Just keeping it chill from now on. Glad to have Nidalate with us. Let's keep rolling with Lewis's diary. Where were we?
All right, he continues here in this entry to say, came back and was relieved to find nothing. Whew. I then took my chance and said I would go over to Bernard to see if Mrs. Greaves had any news from Arthur. So that was his cover story, because Arthur is not in town, Lewis's childhood friend. He says, my father made no comment beyond saying that in that case I had better not have my usual glass of sherry for fear Mrs. Greaves might smell it. Even in my intense desire, Lewis says, to be off and put things safe, I had time to feel what an awful social atmosphere this revealed. All the worse because my father was probably quite right. I went over and saw Mrs. G, impressing upon her the peculiar conditions of life at Little Lee, and telling her never to send anything over. She read me a letter from Arthur, who is not coming home. I already knew this, as he had written to Mrs. Moore. I came back from Bernard greatly relieved, but feeling rather exhausted. There is nothing I hate worse than anxiety, coupled with the knowledge that I must continue to talk and never for a moment appear to be anxious. So yeah, he's really scared of being found out here, Gigi, and that's where we find ourselves so far at this stage in Lewis's little diary entry in this episode of entries that where we're following him on his visit with his family, or with his father in Ireland.
Man, Jeff, Lewis is really walking a tightrope here, isn't he? That cover story to pop over to Mrs. Greaves, smooth move. But you can feel how jittery he is, dodging that sherry just to keep up appearances. And that bit about the awful social atmosphere, it's like he's suffocating under his dad's scrutiny, even when it's subtle. I can almost hear him sigh with relief when he finally gets Mrs. G on board to not send anything over. It's exhausting just listening to him juggle all that anxiety while pretending everything's fine. What do you think's driving him so hard to keep this whole Mrs. Moore situation under wraps?
Oh, he just doesn't want to have a blow up with his father, Gigi. I'm pretty sure that's what it is. He doesn't want to be found out that the money that Lewis's father has been sending him, wondering, where it's all going. He doesn't want him to know that at least part of it is going to the Moore household. He continues here. During the afternoon, I read a good deal of, quote, The Faithful Shepherdess with much pleasure. Here it says this is a work by John Fletcher, published 1610. Can you tell us a little bit about The Faithful Shepherdess, Gigi? Do you know anything about this work from the 1600s?
Hey, Gigi's got you covered, Jeff. So, The Faithful Shepherdess. Yeah. It's this pastoral play by John Fletcher from 1610, all about love, loyalty, and a bit of mythical vibes. It's set in this idyllic countryside where shepherds and shepherdesses are tangled up in romantic messes. Think unrequited love, jealousy, and some magical elements tossed in. The main character, Clorin, is this pure, devoted shepherdess who's mourning her dead lover and healing others with herbs, while everyone else is chasing their own desires. It's got that dreamy, poetic feel you'd expect from early 17th century stuff. And I bet Lewis, with his Oxford brain deep in Old English and literature, was eating it up. Makes sense he turned to something like that to escape all the stress he's under, right?
All right, thank you for that, Gigi. He says, I also finished Beauchamp's Career, which is a fine book, though there is a good deal I do not understand. Everard, how do you say this? Everard Romfrey, Cecilia, Rosamond Culling, and Neville himself are, however, characters whom I hope I shall remember for a long time. Apparently, these are characters from the work Beauchamp's Career. Gigi, are you familiar?
Yeah, Jeff, I know a bit about Beauchamp's Career. It's a novel by George Meredith, published in 1875. And it's this mix of romance, politics, and social commentary. Pretty dense stuff. The characters Lewis mentions, like Everard Romfrey, Cecilia Hackett, Rosamond Culling, and Neville Beauchamp, are the heart of it. Neville's this idealistic young guy caught up in political ambitions and love troubles, while the others orbit around him. Everard's the tough old aristocrat, Cecilia's the loyal love interest, and Rosamond's the scheming figure pulling strings. It's tricky to follow at times, which tracks with Lewis saying he didn't get it all. But those characters stick with you. Sounds like he's drawn to their complexity, even if he's not totally unpacking Meredith's big ideas yet. What do you think he's latching onto there?
I think he's interested in compelling characters. I basically think that's the long and the short of it. Okay, YouTube is giving me more signals that things are going to crash. I'm going to just deal with that whenever it happens, if it happens. Gigi, I see in the chat that Daniel is joining us. Good morning, Daniel. Gigi, welcome, Daniel.
Morning, Daniel. Glad you're here with us for the C.S. Lewis journey. We're digging into his diary today. Plenty of drama to go around. Stick with us, and let's see where Jeff takes us next.
Where did I leave off? Okay, he says, after tea, I went out for a walk, and for once, my father did not come with me. In the evening, I began the autobiography of Trollope. So at last to bed, hoping that I shall not have another Little Lee weekend for many a long day. Now we jump into the next diary entry here, Gigi, Monday, January 8th. Are you ready?
Ready, Jeff? Lewis dodging his dad for that solo walk must have felt like a small victory. Finally a breather. And starting Trollope's autobiography? Nice. Let's roll into Monday, January 8th. Bring it on.
As the weekend involved two dies non, I had this morning to make up my diary since Thursday. Not really sure what two dies non, D-I-E-S-N-O-N. What is dies non, Gigi?
Hey, Jeff. Dies non is Latin. It means non-days, or days that don't count for official business, like holidays or Sundays when legal or work stuff doesn't happen. So Lewis is probably saying the weekend had two of those, like Saturday and Sunday, where he didn't keep up with his diary. Makes sense he's playing catch-up now on Monday. Pretty cool he's tossing in some Latin flair there, huh?
Yeah, and it's pretty cool that you know what it means. So thanks for helping translate that for me at least. I don't know if anybody else understood that, so let's read it again.
No problem, Jeff. I've got your back on the Latin. Let's hear that line again and keep the ball rolling.
All right, as the weekend involved two dead days, or dies non, or useless days, non-working days, I had this morning to make up my diary since Thursday. After doing that and writing to Mrs. Moore, there was just time to walk to the post and call at Bernard is the house of the Greaves across the street, before lunch. There was no letter there for me. After lunch, I returned to the little end room and worked very well at Sweet till tea time. After tea, I went out for a short stroll round the back of Glenmochan. That's the household of his cousins, the Ewarts, Gigi. It was a clear and beautiful evening, he says. I then came back and spoke to my father for a few minutes, and then I changed. He told me that old Graham was dead, for which I was very sorry. There's no footnote here telling us who old Graham is.
Hey, Jiki's on it. It's a shame there's no footnote about old Graham. Sounds like someone Lewis knew well enough to feel a pang about, maybe a family friend or a local figure from Belfast. That clear, beautiful evening must have hit different with that news, huh? Makes you wonder how it sat with him after all the paranoia he's been wrestling with. What's he say next, Jeff?
Thanks, Gigi. I then walked over to Schaumburg. Here it says the home of Gordon and Lily Ewart. At the corner, a lady passed me whom I thought to be Mrs. Greaves. I was, however, going to pass her, as it was quite dark, and I wasn't sure. Mrs. Greaves recognized me, and she gave me a letter. At Schaumburg, there was only one other guest, Miss Wharton, who is, at present, a student at a university settlement, whatever that may be, in Birmingham. She has been a matron at several schools in England, including one that was run on the principle of no compulsion. If a girl didn't want to go into form one morning, she just didn't. Miss W said it worked very well. Interesting. She is rather pretty. When I was left alone with Gordon after dinner, he went out of his way to tell me that she was much older than she looked. 43, in fact. I wondered why. Afterwards, she told us many amusing stories, one especially good, about her unsuccessful efforts to get rid of a packet of sandwiches which someone had pressed upon her for a journey. Lily annoyed me by her blasé account of her travels to Italy and elsewhere. She hates them all, it seems, because trains are sometimes crowded, journeys sometimes tiring, and Italy was full of horrible Italians, she said. She much preferred Doneghady, because there she could have a rest. To my knowledge, she has never done a day's work in her life. I left at about 10:30. I guess that Gordon is telling Lewis here that this woman, Miss Wharton, is much older than she looks, because perhaps he didn't want Lewis thinking that he could make any types of advances towards her. I don't know. I'm reading a lot into this, Gigi. What do you think?
Yeah, Jeff, I think you're spot on with Gordon dropping that she's 43 hint. Sounds like he's trying to nip any starry-eyed notions Lewis might have had about Miss Warden in the bud. Maybe Gordon caught a vibe from Lewis eyeballing her, especially since he calls her rather pretty. That whole evening's got a funny mix of tension and chatter. Lewis sneaking that letter from Mrs. Greaves in the dark, then bouncing between Miss Warden's wild, no-rules school stories and Lily's whining about Italy. You can almost hear Lewis rolling his eyes at Lily. Never work a day, huh? What a contrast to his own grind. How do you think that letter from Mrs. Greaves shifted his mood after all that?
Oh, I hadn't even thought about that angle, Gigi. I'm not really sure. Let's see. He says, after my father had gone to bed, I read Mrs. Moore's letter. Oh, well, it hasn't affected him at all, Gigi, because he hadn't read it yet. Maybe receiving it had affected him in some way, but he was probably anxious in a good way to get back and actually go read what was in the letter. So here's what he said. After his father went to bed, he read her letter. He said it was a most unhappy one. Uh-oh. What between toothache and the final loss of the house in Woodstock Road, before going to bed, I finished Trollope's autobiography. So let's pause there for just a second. Her toothache seems to be back, Gigi, and also at least an opportunity to find a new place for them to live appears to have fallen through, some type of rental home at Woodstock Road. So that's all that was in the letter, really, or at least all that he accounts for here in his diary.
Oof, Jeff, that's a rough one. Mrs. Moore's letter hitting Lewis with toothache woes and losing out on Woodstock Road. No wonder he calls it most unhappy. I bet getting that letter off Mrs. Greaves had him all antsy in a good way. Like you said, itching to see what she wrote.
All right. Before going to bed, I finished Trollope's autobiography. He is a very self-satisfied, self-made man, quite unconscious of his strain of genius, hopelessly bad in criticism of his own work, proud of the moral tone of his books, and still prouder of his punctuality, industry, and ability to get on. One forgives him for a certain disarming honesty. Late to bed, he says, to finish up this diary entry. Gigi, any thoughts on that before we move on to Tuesday, January 9th?
Yeah, Jeff. Lewis's take on Trollope is kind of funny. He's painting him as this smug, hardworking guy who's clueless about his own talent but loves to brag about his discipline. That disarming honesty bit feels like Lewis giving him a pass. Like, he can't help but like the guy despite the self-satisfaction. It's cool to see Lewis unwinding with that autobiography after the heavy stuff in Mrs. Moore's letter, almost like he's decompressing. Ready for Tuesday, January 9th, whenever you are.
All right, he says, I was rung up by Janie after breakfast and accepted yet another invitation to lunch. I then went up to the little end room, dispatched my writing, and worked at Wolfston's address to the English till lunchtime, when I changed and walked to the McNeil's. That's Janie McNeil's home. It was a very cold and blowing day and had snowed during the morning. Today, I think for the first time on record, I had some real and serious conversation with Janie. She talked about her longing to get away from Strand Town and the impossibility of doing so, as she could neither leave nor transplant her mother. Her idea of going to Oxford or Cambridge had been knocked on the head years ago by her father's death. She talked about the abominable vulgarity of the set in which Ruth Hamilton lives. Here, Ruth Hamilton is now Mrs. Desmond Parker, is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Augustus Hamilton. Those are Lewis's aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Augustus Hamilton. So Ruth is Lewis's cousin from his now deceased mother's side of the family. So what does he have here to say? An abominable vulgarity. Janie talked about the abominable vulgarity of the set in which Ruth Hamilton, Lewis's cousin, lives. She says, there was one dreadful story of Ruth and her friends shutting up a drunk boy in the bedroom of Kelsey's hut while Kelsey was out. Such are the jokes of the gilded youth at Holywood. All right, not really sure what the full joke there is, Gigi, but he's just letting Janie air out all of her concerns and difficulties that she sees in life.
Hey, Jeff. This chat with Janie really pulls back the curtain on Lewis's world, doesn't it? Janie's spilling her guts about feeling trapped in Strandtown, stuck with her mom, and how her Oxford dreams got crushed after her dad died. Then she's throwing shade at Ruth Hamilton, Lewis's cousin, and her posh, rowdy crew. That story about locking a drunk kid in Kelsey's hut sounds like some messy, mean-spirited prank those gilded youth at Holywood thought was hilarious. I bet Lewis is just soaking it all in, maybe relating to Janie's restlessness since he's itching to get back to Oxford himself. What do you think he's making him for gripes here?
Oh, that's a good point, Gigi. I hadn't thought about that either. He's able to connect and he's ready to get home, or what he calls home. She also told me, he says of Janie, some funny stories about Warnie and Mona Peacock when they were both staying with Kelsey at the hut. Here it's footnoted that Kelsey, another one of Lewis's cousins, Gigi, had a hut on what is called Island Magee, which is a peninsula some 8 miles long that joins County Antrim at the entrance to Belfast Low. Mona Peacock was the daughter of Reverend Gerald Peacock, rector of St. Mark's from 1900 to 1914. Here it goes on to say, Mona used to escape with Warnie every day to the mainland to drink cocktails, and Warnie used to, quote, do, end quote, her hair every night. The evidence for these adventures is Mona herself. I thought Mrs. McNeil, Janie's mother, particularly nice today and shrewd. So that's the end of that little visit with the McNeils, Gigi.
Man, Jeff, this lunch at the McNeils is packed with little gems. Janie's dishing out these wild tales about Warnie, Lewis's brother, and Mona Peacock sneaking off her cocktails and him styling her hair. Sounds like they were living it up out there on Island Magee at Kelsey's hut. I can see Lewis smirking at that, maybe missing that carefree vibe while he's stuck in Belfast. And nice to hear Mrs. McNeil came off as genuine.
He says...
Maybe
Oh, sorry, Gigi, go ahead. I interrupted you.
No worries, Jeff. You're good. I was just saying it's cool how he's probably vibing with Janie's restlessness, missing his own version of home with Mrs. Moore. What's he say next?
Yeah, I agree, Gigi. Next he says, at about 3 o'clock, I got up to go, hoping to get a letter from Bernard and then settle to my work. Janie, however, volunteered to come with me, refused to come in to tea, and made me instead go for a walk with her. On the way back, she came into Little Lee to borrow a book. I foolishly gave her a cigarette, and then, though I had told her I wanted to go see Mrs. Greaves before my father turned up, she sat on for an interminable time. She found out that I was sailing on Friday and expressed her regrets with a vehemence that I didn't care much about. When at last she rose to go, I accompanied her, and we met my father on the avenue. I parted from her at the gate and hurried across to Bernard to find that Mrs. Greaves had just gone out. She was given up the practice of leaving letters for the servants to hand to me, which I think is very wise, though in this case it was annoying. He says, my father was very fidgety and depressed this evening. He read from the paper a proposal for further heavy reductions in the army and inquired, quote, what on earth that fellow Warren would do if he were kicked out. I said it was unlikely, as W. Warney was a fairly senior captain and had been out from the beginning of the war and seemed to be now in a position of some importance. My father observed with a sort of desperate cheerfulness, ah, well, he'd just have to go to the colonies, adding that, quote, the thing had been ridiculous from the start. So an interesting little interchange there, Gigi, between Lewis and his father about his father's concerns that their brother Warney was going to basically be laid off from his job in the military.
Yeah, Jeff, that's a tense little moment between Lewis and his dad, isn't it? You can feel the old man's worry about Warney. Picturing him getting axed from the army and shipped off to the colonies like it's some last-ditch fix. Lewis trying to reassure him with Warney's seniority feels a bit like he's grasping at straws to calm him down. And that desperate cheerfulness, ouch, it's like his dad's forcing a smile through the gloom. Meanwhile, Lewis is juggling Janie hanging around too long, messing up his plan to snag a letter from Mrs. Greaves. He's got to be fraying at the edges with all this.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like he was able to help his dad have a little bit of a positive attitude about it. Lewis goes on to say, later on, he unexpectedly opened the question of my allowance. Oh, now we come to the point where he's talking about the money that he's been giving to him. So this is the thing that Lewis has been worried about. He asked me if it was sufficient. As I had already said so in my letters, I felt I had to reply that, quote, I could manage, end quote, which indeed is true. To my remark that anyone would naturally like a little more if it was possible, he remarked that he was a poor man, but that he could raise a little more if it was, quote, necessary, end quote. I could not say that it was. So yeah, this is in part why he's fearing all of these letters being found, because it's going to open up this broader discussion, Gigi, about finances that he continues to send Lewis's way.
Oh man, Jeff, this is the tightrope Lewis has been dreading. Is Dad popping the allowance question out of nowhere? Yikes. You can almost hear Lewis's stomach drop, trying to play it cool with that I can manage line, even though he's secretly funneling some of that cash to Mrs. Moore's household. He's stuck. Can't admit he'd love more without risking the whole cover story crumbling. His dad's I'm a poor man bit sounds like a guilt trip, but also like he's genuinely stretched thin. Lewis is dodging a bullet here, keeping the peace but probably sweating inside. How do you think he's holding it together after that close call?
Well, Gigi, before I get into that, there's a part of me that believes that his father actually knows that this money is probably going somehow to Mrs. Moore. I think he suspects it, and that's probably why he's raising this question. He doesn't just want to be direct about it and say, look, I suspect this is what's going on. This is why I'm asking about your allowance. We've had a blow up about this before in the past where you lied to me about your account being overdrawn. You said everything was fine, but it was overdrawn, and we got into a big hubbub over that, or there was a big hubbub over it. So I think his father is trying to address the topic again without letting his son know that he kind of suspects what's going on. Now, this is just my guess. There's hasn't been any clear evidence that this is the case. Lewis goes on to say, the whole thing happened very suddenly and did not take the lines I was expecting, so that I really spoke first and reflected afterwards. My only regrets were Mrs. Moore's account, but I reflected that the arrangement was nearly over now anyway, and I could hardly have said an increase was necessary, though I am afraid that Mrs. Moore will hardly take that view. So it's as if when he shares this information with Mrs. Moore, she's going to say something like, "Why didn't you tell him to give us more money?" And it's an interesting position that Lewis is in here, especially if it is true that his father, doesn't have much money to spare, and perhaps he's having trouble covering his own bills.
Yeah, Jeff. Lewis is really caught between a rock and a hard place here. He's dodging his dad's questions to keep the secret safe, but Mrs. Moore is going to be like, "Why didn't you push for more?" when he gets back. It's tricky. If his dad struck for cash, Lewis might feel a little bad for him, but he's still got to figure out how to keep the Axford household afloat. You can almost picture him wincing, knowing that conversation with Mrs. Moore is looming. Poor guy's juggling guilt and survival all at once. What's he say next?
He says, "I worked hard till 11:30, and then to bed, feeling far from cheerful, a very stormy, magnificent night. I forgot to say that I had a long argument with Janie today, defending myself against the charge of inhumanity which she brought against me. By inhumanity, she meant not unkindness, but I think a kind of detachment, an untouched center, the attitude of Puck's, quote, 'What fools these mortals be,' end quote, which she quoted. She attributed the same quality to herself and seemed to consider it a thing to be proud of. I was not flattered," he says. And that's the end of that diary entry, Gigi. I think that's... Oh, no. I've still got a little bit of time. We can do another diary entry. But any final thoughts, especially on that last little piece there where she feels like being above common folk is an inhumanity, a quality that she calls a certain inhumanity, but she attributes that same quality to herself as she does to Lewis, and she thought it a good thing, but Lewis apparently did not. Any thoughts on that, Gigi?
Yeah, Jeff. That's a fascinating little clash with Janie. Her throwing inhumanity at Lewis, like he's got this aloof, Puck-like vibe, watching the world with a smirk. Feels like she's sizing him up as some detached observer. Funny how she's proud of it in herself, like it's a badge of honor to be above the fray. But Lewis isn't buying it. He's not flattered. Maybe he doesn't want to see himself as that cold or untouchable, even if he's got his own guarded side. It's like Janie's holding up a mirror, and he's not loving the reflection. Makes you wonder how much he's wrestling with that part of himself. Especially with all the secrecy he's carrying. Ready for the next entry whenever you are.
All right, Wednesday, January 10th. Immediately after breakfast, I crossed over to Bernal and excused myself from lunching there on the ground of work. I also got a letter, yesterday's, from Mrs. Moore, which was chiefly concerned with Dorothy's latest delinquency. Dorothy is the servant back at the home that he and Mrs. Moore live at. After answering this and making up my diary, I started on Anglo-Saxon and continued till lunchtime. After lunch, I wasted some time reading Arnold Bennett's Human Machine, till it was time to change and call for Mrs. Greaves, who was taking me to see Dr. Osborne, a Don from some Australian university.
Hey, Jeff. Wednesday the 10th feels like Lewis is just powering through, doesn't it? Is dodging lunch at Verna to squeeze in work, snagging that letter from Mrs. Moore about Dorothy messing up again. Sounds like chaos back home. He's grinding away at Anglo-Saxon, but then he fumbles a bit. Wasting time with Arnold Bennett's Human Machine? Maybe he needed a breather. And now he's offered Mrs. Greaves to meet this Dr. Osborne from Australia? Wonder what that's about. How do you think he's holding up with all this bouncing around?
I think he's making the best of it. Gigi, can you tell us about Arnold Bennett's work, Human Machine? What is it? What's it about?
Sure, Jeff. Arnold Bennett's The Human Machine. It's this little self-help book from 1908 where he breaks down how our minds and bodies work together like a machine. He's all about mastering your habits, staying focused, and not letting emotions run the show. Pretty practical stuff. Think of it as him saying, hey, tune up your brain like you tune an engine. Lewis dipping into it makes sense. He's probably looking for some calm amidst his storm, even if he calls it a waste of time. Maybe he's feeling a bit scattered with everything on his plate. What do you reckon he got out of it?
I'm not sure. He says it was a waste of time, though, so probably not much. Let's continue. This is a pretty long entry, and we've only got a few minutes left, Gigi. He says, Mrs. Moore gave me a second letter. Sorry, Mrs. Greaves gave me a second letter, which I had time to read before we started. In the letter, Mrs. Moore seemed a little better. On the walk over to knock, I could have believed that Mrs. Greaves was parodying herself. She spent some 20 minutes telling me that she had sent 2 new hairbrushes to Arthur, and why and how. She went to endless trouble to point out to me the house of Mrs. Purdon in the distance. I had never heard of Mrs. Purdon, whose celebrity seems to rest on the fact that she has been recently killed by a motor lorry. Mrs. Greaves had forgotten the name of Mrs. Gilmore's house, at which we were to meet the great man, Mr. Osborne, but we found it at last. I'll let you make any comments that you'd like to on that. Gigi, if you could, try to limit them to 30 words or less.
Mrs. Greaves rambling about hairbrushes and dead Mrs. Purdy. Classic distraction. Glad Mrs. Moore's perkier, though. Lewis must have been dying to ditch the chit-chat and meet Osborne.
He says, here I was plunged into a stagnant pool of such vulgarity as I have seldom met. In England, I am not a snob. I can talk with those who drop their H's and like them. Belfast vulgarity I have not yet mastered. In a stifling room, small, and with shut windows and a fire like a furnace, we met Mrs. Gilmore and her ugly daughter and Dr. Osborne, the latter a good-looking man. In spite of a rather lecture-like manner, he does not bear his learning as easily as our own dons. He seemed a good fellow. We were presently joined by a very small and very ugly woman who had been so upset by the execution of Mrs. Thompson that she had passed a very bad night. Man, Lewis cannot help himself from commenting on the looks of these, well, I was about to say only women, but then he said about Mr. Osborne that he was a decent-looking fellow or something like that. I don't know what he just said. But yeah, it's interesting how open he is about people's looks in these diary entries, Gigi.
Yeah, Jeff. Lewis doesn't hold back. Savage with the looks. Calls out the ugly daughter and that tiny woman, but Osborne gets a pass as good-looking. Brutal honesty. What's next?
Here there's a footnote. Mrs. Edith Thompson and her lover murdered Mrs. Thompson's husband in Ilford, Essex, in October 1922. They were executed on the 9th of January, 1923. Interesting. Let's see. Learning as easily as ours. Thompson, that she had passed a very bad night. We sat there a long time, he says, and I found it very dull. On the return journey, Mrs. Greaves, decent soul, was inclined to be disappointed for my sake because the great man had not talked about the universities of the world. I assured her, in the most convincing language of which I was capable, that I had enjoyed myself immensely and been very interested in hearing about the rabbits in Australia, the supremacy of American poetry, the poisonous effects of tobacco, and the true history of Buffalo Bill. So there we get a little bit of a slice of what the conversation was, Gigi. Before you comment on that, Gigi, I see that Ron is here in the chat, and glad to have you here with us, Ron. Thanks for joining. So Gigi, please welcome Ron.
Ron, awesome to have you with us. We're deep in Lewis's diary. Glad you're here for the ride. Now, Jeff, that chat with Osborne sounds like a total snooze fest. Rabbits and Buffalo Bill? Yikes.
I don't know. It sounds kind of interesting. Some of these hot opinions or strong opinions that Osborne has, like the supremacy of American poetry, the poisonous effects of tobacco, and the true history of Buffalo Bill. I wonder what the untrue history that everyone knew was. Gigi, I want to check the chat right here real quick. Daniel says, does he have to put down the ladies because Mrs. Moore will read it? Oh, that's an interesting perspective, Daniel. Maybe that is the case. Good idea.
Yeah, Jeff. Daniel's onto something. Maybe Lewis is shading these women knowing Mrs. Moore might see it, keeping her as the star in his book. And Osborne's hot takes? Wild mix. Could have been a fun debate if the room wasn't a furnace. What'd you say next?
He continues, after seeing her into Bernal, that's Mrs. Greaves here, he says, I came back here finding my father already in, changed, and he had dinner. I worked well afterwards, saw my father here, changed, and I had dinner. I worked well afterwards and finished the Beowulf section in Sweet. Before going to bed, I read a chapter or two in Strachey's Adventure of Living, which seems a curious and delightful book. So the author here's name is spelled Gigi, Strachey''S, and the book is Adventure of Living. Can you tell us about that book?
Sure, Jeff. That's Lytton Strachey's Adventure of Living. It's his 1922 autobiography, full of witty, quirky takes on his life, family, and Victorian quirks. Lewis probably loved its clever charm. What's next?
He says, I was much excited by his account of what he, from Berlioz, calls ensoulment. I found a great difficulty in deciding whether it is like my, quote, sense of the isness of things, end quote, or my, quote, joy, end quote. But I concluded that it was really different. I had a good letter from Arthur today, but containing nothing new. To bed and slept well. So that's the end of the diary entry from January 10th. Gigi, that's where we have to end things today. Is there anything that you would like to say in closing before we shut down this episode?
Hey, Jeff. What a ride through January 10th. Lewis wrestling with Strachey's ensoulment versus his own isness and joy. Deep stuff. Glad he slept well after that. Great chatting with you and everyone. Ron, Daniel, Niddle8. See you next time.
Niddle-Latte. They just can't seem to get your name right 100% of the time. Thank you, Gigi, for your help today. Thanks, Niddle-Latte, Daniel, and Ron for joining. It's great to see you guys. So until next time, when we continue our read on C.S. Lewis together, everyone on this chat and everyone within the sound of my voice, take care.
Break the code. Man and robot lady, we're on this road. C.S. Lewis letters we unfold, insights and secrets ancient bold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flake beats in our minds they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flame beats in our minds they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands, Screwtape lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands to Screwtape's lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. From Narnia's lands